Hello, and welcome to the TCNewTech Fiberside chat, where we are talking all about fiber, fiber internet, and how its importance to our area. And it's become even more important these days because of our COVID situation, and it's going to just continue to be an important part of our lives. So that's why TCNewTech has taken it on as an important initiative on our agenda. I'm Jennifer Zunko, and I'm the Executive Director of TCNewTech. I'm here with Russ Schindler, who's CEO of SampleServe, and he is also president of TCNewTech. And we're joined by Jarrett Skorup. He's the Director of Marketing Communications at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. And the reason we reached out to the Mackinac Center is one of his colleagues had posted a editorial piece in the Record Eagle, and we thought it was really interesting. It was all about their position on fiber. So Jarrett was agreed to sit down and chat with us about fiber. And Russ, did you want to ask some questions?
Actually, I think the article was not just about fiber; it was about government-funded fiber. You're not against fiber; you're against government-backed fiber projects that compete with private industry. Is that correct? I mean, I'll tell you what. I'll let you explain. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I like fiber. I certainly like Netflix and Amazon Prime. So and the few video games when I get a chance to play them. So yes, we of course, we like fiber, high-speed internet. We want more of it for more people. We are skeptical of to some extent of government involvement, and particularly networks that are publicly funded or publicly owned. But yeah, I think we're on the same page of wanting more high-speed internet and more high-speed internet options.
Right, and the difference, Russ, maybe you can explain, between fiber and just the standard cable that's plugged into my house.
Yeah, so the big difference is fiber can just carry a lot more data, and it's symmetrical, meaning it does the same speed up as down. And so, for instance, typical cable, and it varies. And I want, you don't need to send me email saying like, oh, it's it varies. It can be from 70 to 200 up, and I'm sorry, down, where you can receive the information. But typically, and again, it can vary. It can be anywhere from 3 to 15 back out, and that's really where the lag comes in. It was like you're trying to do video chatting like we are right now. You can probably do one person in your household doing the video chatting, but if you're trying to do two or more, it becomes a problem, especially even for businesses. And that's really where our concern comes in, is not just for my company, but for other tech companies in town. And Traverse City's turned into a big tech town, is we need that back and forth, that up and down, and it just wasn't available.
And so, it was interesting because last month we were broadcasting, and I was at my home, which has standard cable. Russ was in his office, which has fiber delivered by Michigan Broadband Services. And we happen to be at Michigan Broadband Services today using their fiber internet at the Grand Traverse Commons. And I'm loving it because last month I kept cutting out and losing my connection with my standard cable connection.
Yeah, and we didn't do it here for commercial endorsement. It was more just because, like, hey, we got to be able to make sure that we're not stalling out in the middle of our broadcast. So.
Solid connection.
And they were willing to let us come and sit in their office for free. So, so anyway, Jarrett, so kind of go into the reasons why you don't like municipal-backed fiber projects.
Sure. Yeah, so generally, the Mackinac Center, we're a free market economic think tank. There's certainly a role for government in a lot of areas. For a lot of commercial areas, we apply what generally is known as, I don't even know if we can say it anymore, but it's a yellow pages test. So nobody knows what that, you guys know what it is, probably yellow pages are, but For the young people, we'll explain. So yellow pages are basically, if you have these businesses and companies that are available in the yellow pages, the government probably shouldn't be involved in it. And so we think that there are private companies that offer these services and even broadband services. And so I think that government networks should be the last thing down the line. So the first is how do you encourage competition among providers in the area? What can you do to get more of them in? And I think for any city, Traverse City being one of them, you can kind of cut the regulations. You can make it easier for right-of-way access and these different things where these companies are able to more easily invest in the town. There still are going to be areas where perhaps fiber is not profitable. And if that's the case, then I think that I would move towards where you have some targeted government subsidies for people to pay for high-speed internet or fiber connections. And then the last resort down the line after you've explored those options would be going to a network that's publicly funded, because what we've seen around the country is that most of the projects and the networks that are publicly funded or publicly owned, they tend not to be financially viable. And this is even true coming out of the 2008, 2009, where we had a big stimulus fund. We had a lot of money going around the country to build these networks, and still most of them were not financially viable. There are some that have been more successful, but just from a principal perspective, we would be nervous about using taxpayer funds to back these projects, because it puts them on the hook for something that we think should be done in the private sector.
So I got a couple of counterpoints to that. The studies that I've seen referenced for these projects that didn't work, they all reference, they're all dated like 2008, 2009, maybe even 2010 or 12. But we're in a different world now. In 2008, 2009, Netflix didn't exist, and they existed, but they were more of a CD platform. And so, the need, Zoom meetings, that kind of stuff, the stuff that we do every day, it just didn't exist then. And so they didn't have people who are like, hey, I can check my email. And so I don't need more speed to check my email. But the market, or the need for speed is a lot different than it was then. And so the take rate is a lot higher on speed increases fiber projects. So if you look at more, if you used a city today, you're going to see a lot different economics and a lot higher take rate. And these projects mostly are successful now. I'm not saying they're all successful. And then the other thing is the models that you were talking about back then, of studies that you're citing, are all based on the municipality being the ISP, where they're the ones doing the fiber. And as a matter of fact, if there's one point that you and I agree on, is that Traverse City should not be its own ISP. The technology exists where they can essentially own the dark fiber network. They build the network and then allow private companies to kind of operate simultaneously. You're going to have, 10, 12 different companies operating on the government-owned network, but they all provide different services, different pricing, different, speed rates. So I'm a fan of that model. I'm agreeing with you on the government shouldn't be an ISP. So with those two kind of points, what are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, no, I agree there. And I think that there has been networks where it's gone a little bit more to that model where there's kind of the public ownership, but you're still allowing private companies to compete and do that last line of service, which is, I think is a good model. One thing of course I agree that we need more high speed, and there's certainly more demand for higher speed broadband and fiber networks than there used to be. And we don't necessarily have all the research on the newer networks. But I also think that leaves a point of, there's always a question that I ask on these things, which is, if there's so much demand and people really want this, then why does government need to be involved in it? And because obviously private networks do want to make money. They want to offer something that people want. And so I think the criticism more is, I think they do a better job building it out when it makes sense to do it. And I think they're more responsive to the demand hands of what people want, because some people, obviously your company and a lot of people do really want fiber networks where they have these huge speeds, upload and download speeds. But I also think a lot of people, they just don't want it. If you go to people like my parents who really, they only use their networks just to do email, they're not going to pay for it, and really they don't want to pay for it as a taxpayer. And I know Traverse Cities is set up very differently than that, where it is set up more for ratepayers picking it up the cost. But I think the private sector does a better job in terms of, here's the people who directly want it, here are the areas that need it, and they're very responsive to that in the way that the government might not be.
And I agree with you. If we could get private industry to come in and fill in the gap, but for instance, like, why didn't Charter do this? And they're starting to up their game. Just since we kind of got the Traverse City Light and Power to be a fiber network, and Michigan Broadband's moved in, Traverse City or Charter Spectrum is up their game. But there's no incentive to add to your infrastructure when you have 95% of the market plus already. There's no reason to spend money there, and they weren't until there was this threat of competition. So competition, I think you'll agree, as a free market capitalist, is a good thing. I also agree that I'd prefer it be private industry, but if it's not, but here's my big thing. You go out to these small towns, the Kalkaskas, the Meesiks, the Buckleys, these towns are dying on the vine. And the reason is people more and more will not live in a place where they can't get at least cable internet. And, it's an economic sustainability issue from my perspective to get broadband and, good broadband. Now, I'm not talking about DSL. If you're going to make the investment, do it right. And so I don't know if you've seen a plan that I suggested where all electric utilities become high-speed fiber optic utilities as well, because they own all the right-of-ways. They are their best position to actually supply. And, I suggest something like the Rural Electrification Act, on the early 1900s, where they said, look, we're going to provide electricity to everybody in the state. And I think you would agree it was probably a good idea. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, and that's a model. I've heard that argument before. I think there's some analogies to the internet with that. I think we learned a lot of lessons from that too, which is for a long time, you really did have where the government controlled those networks, and you really didn't get a lot of innovation going on for a long time. So if you're the people old enough, you'll remember Ma Bell and really, I remember even when I was a kid and calling my grandparents, and it was $7 a minute, and now we're Ma Bell has since been broken up, and we do have a lot of providers. So we do have those lines in the network laid, but because we have more competition in that space, prices have gone down. I'd argue services has improved. So I think we're in agreement on that. And I think, in terms, I don't know all the specifics on, the Traverse City area particularly, but it is always a question of, why does one company control so much of the market, and what the city and what public employees and elected officials should do is, how do we open this up to competition? And I recall reading in Traverse City that there was another company that did want to come in and lay more high-speed internet lines and some fiber lines, and then they had trouble with the cost and the right-of-way and the local regulatory options. And so I know that the city just wasn't willing to budge on that as much as the company wanted, and I don't know who was right in that situation. But I do think that cities should first go to the well of, how do we encourage competition? What regulations can we cut? How do we make it easier for these people to come in, these companies to come in and lay the lines and get people what they want? And then move on to, okay, here's these pockets of areas where it's just not profitable and they're not laying the lines, and then figure out the step of targeting those subsidies and the help to those areas.
Yeah, that was actually Lightspeed. They're out of Lansing. I know he did encounter a little bit of bureaucracy, but I do think it was a little more posturing than it was actual hard facts and in terms of the bureaucracy. And I can completely agree. Government is just not the go-to source for solving problems and innovation. But as you indicated right when we first started, there's a role for government and utilities, things. It all depends on whether you think internet is now a utility. I believe it is. I think the federal government believes it is. It'd be like saying, well, you can get water from, anybody. You can buy bottled water if you want to supply your home. Like, why does the city got to be involved in water distribution? And so that's kind of how I see it. I think there is a room for city owned infrastructure, but public or private competition on that infrastructure. So I'm I'm making the comparison that there's a role for government, like in water and sewer and electricity. And so what are your thoughts on like that comparison that internet is a utility and there is room for government to be involved?
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion. So, I mean, 85% of water is delivered by private companies in the United States. It operates a little differently because, the government, the public entity basically guarantees it, and it's kind of the distribution method and who's overseeing it. I can see that argument. Whether I don't know if I'd put internet as important as water or electricity. There still are people that won't use internet or at least high speed internet, I should say. They don't see it quite the same way. I also kind of see this like, there are other things that are as important or more important than high speed internet, like food. I mean, food is a necessary part of our life, but we don't go and say, let's have government run grocery stores. What we do is we have private providers. We encourage competition between them. And when there's people who can't afford it or and need it, we directly subsidize those people, and we make it very targeted, and that operates pretty efficiently. For the reasons you stated and how you lay lines and where people live in these rural areas. Of course, internet is operating differently. And if we need to have the discussion over how do you subsidize laying fiber lines to these rural areas where there really would never be profitable to do it, then I think that's one discussion. But I do think that's different than talking about government-owned networks. Michigan, where we're talking about, in Traverse City, where we do have a company that's doing that, or in Holland, Michigan, where you do have a couple of competing companies. And for me, then the question there is, how do we get more of these companies to compete with each other so that people get better service and lower costs?
It feels like a bit of a catch-22 because, as you were saying earlier, the studies in the past have shown that that there isn't great enough demand to make it profitable for a corporation, but government doesn't necessarily have to
Make a profit.
Yeah, make a profit. So they have little different rules. So how do we have some kind of collaboration that works for everybody?
Yeah. So I guess what's your opinion on, a dark fiber network owned by a municipality or a local unit of government, and but they open it up for private competition on that network? They'd have to pay a fee and to cover the cost of maintaining the network. But so, what are your thoughts on that? Is that something you'd be in favor of, or?
I think if you're going to go the route of doing a government network, that's how I would do it, so that you get private demand. What I would worry about if you have a bunch of overlapping networks that are out there. So if you're starting that new network in an area where there are already companies operating, but I think if you are going to do it, there have been models out there, and even in some rural areas in Michigan where the government maybe pays to lay the fiber line and then outsources it after that, which is a lot more cost effective than some of the networks we've seen in some of the ones we talked about that weren't successful, where the government was trying to manage the tech side and all these different things, where you do have private companies that are much more experienced. So if you were to do it, then like I said, I go down the list of options. First, how do we encourage competitions? What regulatory barriers? Then go to, do we just directly subsidize people who need it? And then down to that model would be one that I would go down to if you still aren't filling the need for people that want it.
One of the problems with running, a bunch of individual private companies running their own network are, there's rules and just practicality on how many lines you can put on a regular pole. And, there's rules about what's got to be at the top and how much separation, the electricity is usually at the top, and then, you put these other lines as you go down, but then you got to also maintain a certain height so trucks and stuff can get underneath it. So you end up like with this area where you can only hang lines, and once it's full, there's no more room on the pole. And I think that was one of the problems that Lightspeed had in terms of permitting, and they had some ideas on what they wanted to save some space for, which I think was their own network. And so it's a lot more complicated than most people would probably realize. You obviously are versed in it, but so, pole, sometimes, they're telling like somebody, hey, we'll let you run your private network, but you got to go and, put 10-foot tall poles on all up and down here, 10-foot taller poles, and then you got to pay to move everything over. And so that becomes cost prohibitive for somebody just wants to run a fiber down to one block or something. So,
and maybe I'm more optimistic on like 5G and some of these new networks that potentially come along that eliminate at least some part of that problem. So I'm hopeful for that, because I understand that is a concern. I guess I was referring more to like pretty high cost to cross right-of-ways, because obviously the public and the government is setting the rules on right-of-ways. I think things like that could be made easier for private companies.
Yeah, well, it sounds like we agree on 99% of the stuff. So
we do have somebody that's watching right now that had a question, and their question was, what about the economic development effects? With more companies and workers going remote, high bandwidth connections enable workers and companies to set up headquarters in the area and increase tax revenue. And yeah, I wondered about that too. I mean, I feel like a lot of what we're talking about, we may not be basing these comments or these decisions on current times. I mean, are we talking about yesterday and the yellow pages?
Yeah, well, a little bit. I mean, Russ went back to the 1930s with the electric, so I had.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
You guys are showing your age.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, sure. I think the economic development. It's a lot harder to measure. With there was one broadband study that looked at a lot of projects, and that's what they tried to measure was what kind of economic effects did these have. To Russ's point, they only looked at a 5-year period, so it was a pretty short-term area, and they found that the government-owned networks had minimal effects on the economic development. They measured things like income and job growth of employees. But I think the reason for that is also something that Russ said, which is the private providers may very well have been responding to that competition and kind of upping their game. So I think it's hard to, obviously having high speed and fiber internet, the better internet you have, it's going to be better in general overall. The question is, who's going to do a better job providing that and taking the cost into consideration, the public side or the private side, or some hybrid model that we've been talking about.
Gerald, one thing, TCNewTech, our whole model is we have startups that are pitching their ideas to an audience of investors and people interested in new technology. So the feedback that we're getting is from these startups that want to launch in Traverse City, but they're finding it difficult and because of the lack of high-speed internet.
And that is changing, and Michigan broadband, like I can't only be right now in a certain geographic area just because, we have, 3, 4, 5 people doing web training, video conference training at the same time. And I can't do that on cable unless I have multiple cable lines coming in. And, the fiber just is reliable. It's quick, it's fast, it's up and down. And so, it's not just, that's just my example, but we're not going to get a bigger tech company move to Traverse City until we have good, reliable fiber internet. And when, things like COVID hit, there's a snowstorm and everyone's got to work from home, well, they can keep working from home. And so whether they live out in Leelanau County or, right downtown Traverse City, they want to be able to have that connectivity and reliability. And it's an economic development issue. And it's not just Traverse City. Obviously, we're focused on Traverse City because we live here, but it's every town in the country. And so internet connectivity is, the future of technology and economic development, and it's not everything, but it's going to be a big part of it, I think. And
yeah.
So
yeah,
it's increasingly important for sure. Yeah, I mentioned before my parents weren't. They live in a real rural area that I grew up in, and for a long time they were working with me and my brother. They just wanted email, and that changed about a year ago actually. So now they're shelling out, and they don't have a great provider. But it was my dad just wants to watch YouTube videos of guys fishing. That's his economic development for him. But
right, yeah.
Right.
Well,
right.
on the company side, of course, it's more and more important every year.
Well, I never saw the value in it myself. I mean, my internet was fine at home until I started live streaming, or until I had my daughter home who's working for her company from our home and doing webinars and Zoom meetings. My husband's on online auctions, and our son is home from college, seeing lectures via Zoom, and I'm trying to live broadcast. And all of a sudden, I saw the importance of faster internet.
Yeah.
But it's probably just like satellite radio. When that came out, I said, who in the world would pay for radio? And now, how can you live without it?
Yeah, when you're doing an online auction, a millisecond could be the difference between getting a bid or not. So.
That's true.
Investors, and of course right now with kids in school, I mean it literally is, do they get an education or do they not? And so I'm totally in agreement with that. Of course, I maybe I tend to think that the private sector, they're measuring that, but like Russ said, they care about that if they have competition from other spaces. I mean, any company is going to try to make as much money as they can, but if they have competition and it's okay, we have to make a better product and we have to keep an eye on what we're charging people, that's how you do get a better service. And so I think the more we can do to encourage that, the better service we're going to get.
Yeah, I think so too. And so we really appreciate you coming on and chatting with us and giving us your viewpoint. We're, just want to keep the discussion alive. As we mentioned, Traverse City Light and Power is working on fiber in this area. And so we're hoping that we can get them involved in the discussion as well.
Yeah, we invited them to this meeting, and, it was kind of short notice, but hopefully they can make it on sometime.
Yeah. And so we can hear all sides of the story. And, we have a reason for wanting more access in this area and bringing more access to Traverse City and the whole Grand Traverse region. So it's great to hear everybody's opinion, and we can solve all the world's problems here.
And I think we agree this, the model that Traverse City is using is not the ideal model that you and I would pick, but from my perspective, it's better than not doing it all. So
it's a start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Good.
Appreciate
Thanks
you having me.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Jared. I
we'll
appreciate
be in touch with you. Thanks a lot.
All right.